Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mike Nichols. I'm Commercial Director for Cybersecurity Services at Bureau Veritas, and I'm very pleased to be hosting you today. Today's subject is ransomware, one of the fastest growing threats in cybersecurity. We'll talk a little bit about the nature of ransomware attacks, but also what practical steps you can take to increase your resilience against them. Our speaker today is Paul Pols. Paul, thanks for joining us. Thanks for speaking today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Good to be here. Thank you, Mike. My name is Paul. I'm a principal security specialist at Secura, Bureau Veritas company. I have a background as an ethical hacker. I did that for 7 years. After that, I worked in the intelligence domain. And at Secura, I'm responsible for everything that has to do with ransomware resilience. So researching what these attackers are doing in practice, but also streamlining our services to make sure that we help our clients to fend off these attacks.
Thank you, Paul. So for those of you who are not familiar, Secura is a key part of our cybersecurity offering at Bureau Veritas. Secura is a Dutch company with over 100 cybersecurity experts, and their mission is to provide insight into digital security, always with a link to international standards and certification. What's interesting about Secura is that they offer a holistic approach to cybersecurity, working across the three main dimensions of people, process, and technology. And as we'll see today, all three of these dimensions are relevant to the subject of ransomware. Secura joined the Bureau Veritas family in 2001, and it's our primary center of excellence for cybersecurity. Secura is organized into different market groups, but what's important to reference is that they work across both IT, OT, and also connected products or IoT. They also work with a very broad range of customers covering many different sectors. So you can see the different market groups here: public, industrial, tech, finance, and others. And this is also quite relevant to the subject of ransomware, because this is a threat which is going at all different sectors, regardless for an organization. Before I hand off to Paul, just a very quick housekeeping note. We've reserved time at the end for questions and answers, but you don't have to wait until the end to put your questions into to submit your questions. There's a question box on the webinar panel, so you can drop your questions in there at any time. But also there will be a survey at the end of the webinar, and we appreciate if you can take 30 seconds to answer it. Your feedback is very valuable. So Paul, thanks for being with us here today. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So what you see here is the agenda for today. Let's go through it real quick. First, I want to tell you about some attacks that I think are noteworthy in the last year and a half, and some lessons learned from those attacks. Then I want to talk to you about the threat landscape. So what are the actors that are involved in this space, and what kind of attacks are they performing? And against that backdrop, I'll explain how companies can increase their ransomware resilience. I'll give some generalized tips and also tell you what we're doing in this space. And then at the end, there will be room for questions and answers, as Mike just mentioned. But first, let's go into some recent attacks. And when I say recent, I think it's important to note that these attacks are happening basically every day. So this is an overview of a dashboard that I follow. I took a screenshot of it earlier this week when I was preparing this presentation, and you see every day companies are being hit by different kinds of ransomware gangs. And it can be anything, right? So you see here Kuwait Airways was hit by Lockbit on June 20th. But you also see all sorts of small companies that have been hit: London Roofing, fitness and wellness company, basically all sorts of companies in all sorts of different sectors are being targeted by these kinds of groups. And most of them are not making the news anymore, because we've sort of grown accustomed to that. There are lots of other things going on in this world today. So These attacks are not getting as much attention anymore, but they're still happening every day. But I don't want to focus just on what happened in the last few days. I want to sort of zoom out, see what happened in the last year and a half, and take some lessons learned from that, and also relate them to the different sectors that we're working for here at Secura. So I'll start with talking about an attack on Kia in the automotive sector in February of last year. Then about the Colonial Pipeline attack, which is one of the most influential attacks that has happened to date. On the attack on the health service executive in Ireland in the public sector. I'll talk about Exagrid in the technology sector, about Curo Fund Services in the finance sector. Let's just go through them and see what kind of lessons we can learn from those attacks. So the first one I want to highlight is an attack on Kia. It was performed by the Doppelmayr gang. The customers of Kia were noticing that all sorts of things were not working anymore. So the website was not working, the application was not working, phone services were down because they probably relied on a voice over IP. So they noticed all sorts of disturbances with the customer-facing systems of Kia. And Kia and Hyundai Motor, the parent company, actually denied that a ransomware attack was going on. But what you have to keep in mind for these kinds of attacks is that these gangs typically have leak websites where they also put the names of the companies that they have attacked and the demands that they're asking for in terms of ransomware. So anyone that is following these websites, researchers, but also journalists, they can look at these websites and they know who is being targeted. That's also the source of the overview that I showed you earlier in the presentation of all the different companies that were attacked in the last few days. So flat out denying that you've been hit by a ransomware attack, if that is not true, is actually a very bad strategy, because there are lots of ways in which people will notice from outages, but also from the leaked websites, that your organization has been targeted. In this case, the Doppelmayr gang asked for somewhere between 400 and 600 Bitcoin, depending on how fast the ransom would be paid. That translated to about 20 to 30 million US dollars. And we never saw data published from this attack. So it is very likely that Hyundai Motor America ended up paying a certain amount in order to get back the keys to the stolen data and to the data that had been encrypted. So I would say the takeaway here is, if you are hit by an attack like this, always be upfront about it. That's definitely the best strategy from what I've seen so far in all of these cases. Now, the next one I want to highlight is the attack on the Colonial Pipeline systems. So this attack was performed by DarkSide in May of 2021. It hit a company that is responsible for a gasoline pipeline that runs basically from Washington, D.C. all the way to Houston. It's responsible for 50% of the gasoline in the East Coast of the US. The IT systems of this company were hit with ransomware, but as a precautionary measure, they also shut down their OT systems, so the systems that are responsible for keeping this pipeline flowing. It could have been precaution. Some say it was because the billing systems didn't work and that they didn't want to provide services without being able to bill them. But the pipeline was shut down for a number of days. It caused fuel shortages on the East Coast, so it was really having a societal impact. And it was actually a broader thing in May of 2021. There were a couple of really big organizations hit in the US. So in addition to Colonial Pipeline Systems, JBS, a meat processing company, which also caused shortages in the supermarkets. And yeah, it was really started to have real life effects. And that's also when the Biden administration decided to step in. They decided that they would get their intelligence and security services involved to go after some of these ransomware gangs that were targeting large organizations in the US. And while that is definitely a good thing, it raises the risk for these kinds of groups and also acts as a deterrent. It also means that for the countries that have not decided to get their security and intelligence services involved, they may be at a higher risk, because these groups may decide to leave the US alone because that poses a higher risk to them, and target other companies elsewhere in the world where the risks are not as high. So the lesson learned here, I would say, is that the involvement of the security and intelligence services raises the risk for these groups, and that means that the risks are higher in countries that don't. So, for instance, to the involvement of the services in the US, they were able to recover part of the ransom that was paid in this case. Another example, this one in the public sphere, is the attack on the health service executive and the Department of Health in Ireland. They were attacked by the Conti ransomware in May of 2021. They actually noticed weird things were going on in their systems. They got a specialized cybersecurity firm involved who installed their software managed detection and response software on those systems, and they were actually able to stop part of this ransomware attack from successfully encrypting some of their systems. And I think they were really lucky in Ireland that they were able to deal with it that quickly and to make sure that there were not all sorts of trickle-down effects, because the health service executive is responsible for lots of things that have to do with the healthcare system in Ireland. So they were responsible for corona vaccinations, for hospitals. So you can understand if a group successfully manages to encrypt all of the systems that have to support these critical services to the public, the impact can be really high and people can end up dying. So I think this is an example that really shows the kind of impact that these groups can have, and that they really don't care what the effects of some of their attacks are. I've seen people bragging online for attacking children's hospitals, and they don't care about the chance that someone, even if it's a kid, would die in their pursuit of high gains. So that is the takeaway here. They will stop at nothing. Another example that I've highlighted here is Exagrid. What I thought was interesting about the attack on this company is that it's actually a company that specializes in ransomware recovery. So they're on the defensive side, specifically targeted at this problem. They have award-winning software, but they were the victim of a ransomware attack by Conti themselves in May of 2021. And they also sort of denied that they were attacked. Actually, they said they will not say anything about their network security, but they were doing business as usual. But in this case, journalists were able to get access to the chats that this company was having with the ransomware attackers. You see an example at the bottom here where you see that Exagrid was negotiating the ransom demand. Actually, the Conti group also posted some proofs on SendSpace, which is a file sharing website, to show to Exagrid what kind of data they had stolen at the company. And by the time that the journalists got access to this chat, the links were still valid. They could still go to SendSpace and download the stolen data. So there was really no denying that this company had been hit by a ransomware attack. So yeah, another example of how third-party risk can be something you need to take into account, because if you have your data stored at this company, a ransomware attack on this third party could affect you. But it's also an example again of why denying that you've been hit is not a great strategy, because there's so many ways in which this information can come out and then it just looks bad on you. The last example I want to highlight here is the attack on Curo Fund Services. It's a South African finance firm. They were hit in January of this year, and they manage 2 trillion rand. So that translates to about 125 billion euros. And this company was also hit by a ransomware attack. And what I think it's noteworthy from this specific case is that even though the hackers were inside of the network of a company that manages funds of an enormous size, so literally billions of euros, they still did the same trick, right? So they used their access to roll out ransomware and try to monetize that access just through a ransomware demand, while they could also have gone through the trouble of targeting their financial systems, trying to gain access to those funds and trying to monetize that. So even if there's lots of funds that are available at a company, they will still do the same trick. They will try to get as much access as they can in the network, and then they will roll out ransomware. So that is something to keep in mind. It is also, from a defensive point of view, something that could help, because if they're doing the same trick everywhere, basically, then that also allows you to defend against that trick better. But that brings me to the next topic. So who are we trying to defend against? What does this really look like in the background? Because there's lots of misconceptions about that going on. The first thing I want to highlight here is that there are lots of actors involved in these kinds of attacks. So these are not fully automated sort of worms that are spreading themselves. There are people on the other side of the keyboard that are doing each step of these attacks. So these are human operated ransomware attacks, and there are different parties involved in the background that all play their own role in performing these attacks. So the first party that is involved are the targets. So these are the organizations that are just going about their business, that are being targeted by these different groups. And when we talk about these groups such as Lockbit and Conti and Black Cat, we are usually talking about ransomware operators. So those are the developers of the ransomware. They create this strain of ransomware, for instance, Conti, and then they put that out there as a service for freelancers to use, basically. And those freelancers, those are the ransomware affiliates. They use the ransomware that they can get from the developers, and they try to attack targets with that ransomware. So that is also how these groups can be so prevalent, because the addition of ransomware affiliates, basically freelancers, allows them to scale to a massive scale with these kinds of attacks, because they don't have to perform them themselves. Now, sort of a recent addition to this whole landscape are the initial access brokers. They're separate from the ransomware operators and the ransomware affiliates, and they basically specialize in getting into the networks of companies. And then they will typically sell that access to ransomware affiliates who could do this themselves. But again, in terms of specialization and scaling, it's easier to just buy access to a company from an initial access broker than doing everything yourself. So again, initial access broker is something that allows this whole scene to scale in the way that it's doing right now. So how does this whole thing work in practice? Well, let me talk you through it. Typically, these initial access brokers, they are one-trick ponies. They have one or a few tricks up their sleeve, and they're trying it basically everywhere they can. So for instance, they have an exploit that was published by a researcher. They will take that exploit and they will try to fire it off against all the systems that they can find in the entire IP space of the whole internet. So basically, they're scanning and trying to exploit every system on the internet that is vulnerable to their exploit. And that would be one way to get access to lots of systems, and basically you're ending up with random access to systems all over the internet that are vulnerable to your one trick. Another way would be, that doesn't involve exploit, would be trying to gain access through basically remote login services. So for instance, you may have a VPN, a remote facility, or a remote desktop, remote access to your network, where your employees or other users can log in through a username and a password. Well, if that is not protected through a second factor, it could be targeted by these kinds of actors through stolen passwords or through leaked passwords or through default passwords, trying to log into those systems to get their foot in the door inside your network. Another very prevalent option in which they're trying to do the same thing is phishing. So they're sending massive amounts of emails, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of emails to big lists of email addresses that they can find somewhere, and they're sending them typically documents that someone will open in order to execute code on the system of the affected user. And in that way, they will also get their foot in the door in your network. So these are the most prevalent ways through which initial access brokers get their foot into the door inside of your network. And then what they end up with is basically a list of IP addresses that they have compromised. And that's when they start going through the list, figuring out who they have actually compromised. So up until that point, they're basically throwing this against everything they can. And then once they have the infections coming in, they start to look at what kind of victims are in there. What companies have I actually been able to access? And depending on the level of access that this user has, so is it just a user or is it an administrator? What kind of sector is this company active in? What is their revenue? Then they will start to drill down on some of those infections in order to monetize them. And it can actually go between initial access broker when one initial access broker sells it to another, and then they will try to develop that access by compromising more systems to make the access that they have to the network of one of these companies more valuable. And I have an example here of how this actually works. This typically happens, for instance, through fora that are specifically tailored toward these kinds of activities. They're mostly really closed down forums, and lots of the information there is in Russian. But there are companies that specialize in gaining access to those sort of dark web websites, such as the Israeli company Kayla. They managed to get their way in, so through fake user accounts in invite-only settings. They get access to these fora, then they scrape all the data there, and they allow researchers or clients to search through all that data in order to see if maybe their information is being traded on these dark web websites. So here you see an example of where I searched through the data from Kayla for instance, the Netherlands, and found that they were offering RDP access to an organization in the waste processing sector where someone has infected 3 PCs and is selling that access to anyone that's interested at a starting price of $10 and a blitz price of $100. For somewhere between $10 and $100, you can get access through 3 random PCs at some waste company in the Netherlands through RDP. So this is basically how they're selling these kinds of access, and then someone could buy it and try to get more access to make this network access worth more money. And here's an example of how these prices start to go up. So for instance, here again, thanks to Kayla, I have an example of where someone is selling access to 10 different networks. So administrative access to companies in different kind of sectors with high privileges. And that level of access is starting to sell at a higher price. So the start price here is $3,000 US dollars with a blitz price of $5,000. And here you see that they're really starting to zoom in to what are these companies doing. So what kind of industry are they in? What is their revenue? Because the revenue directly translates to how much money will they be able to ask for as a ransom once they have encrypted their systems. So this is where these untargeted attacks, basically at the very start, when these initial access brokers were doing their thing, start to become much more targeted, and where they are really drilling down on what kind of company it is and what their revenue is and how much money they can gain from each of these companies. Well, the offers can go back and forth between these initial access brokers where they sell access and give the keys to each other. And why is that important to understand that this is happening in the background? Well, because it can also explain why there may be some delays in these kinds of attacks. So here is an example of where someone was selling off access to a law firm in October of last year. And then when I was researching this a couple of months ago, you see that same actor is still trying to sell that access 5 months later. They're doing a 30% discount on the price. And for those 5 months, someone has had access to this law firm. The law firm was in a position to find this infection and to eradicate it before it is being sold off to the next actor who may end up using it to roll out ransomware throughout the network. So this explains why sometimes there are delays in these kinds of attacks. So after the initial infection, it could take a while before someone picks it up and tries to exploit other systems, and then it may be another while before someone rolls out ransomware. So that, as a defender, gives you some time to respond, basically. Well, not all companies are as lucky. So here you see an example of access actually being offered and sold. You see the access to a German manufacturing company and a Dutch shipbroking company with domain admin privileges. So the highest privileges within the Windows domain, within the network, basically, is being sold off to an unknown actor, and that is generally going to be a ransomware affiliate. So at this point, the initial access broker sells off his or her access to a ransomware affiliate for a certain amount in Bitcoin. Now, the ransomware affiliates, they can either do this themselves, or they can take this access that they get from an initial access broker and combine it with the ransomware that they're getting from a developer and merge these two together, basically, the access and the malware, in order to roll out ransomware within one of these organizations that is being targeted. Now, hopefully, if that happens to a company, you'll be able to use your backups to recover so that you don't have to pay these ransomware operators. But frequently, for all sorts of different reasons, that is not possible or not the best option. And then companies end up paying the ransomware operators or the developers to get back the access to their data. And then how this typically works is that the ransomware operators or developers, they receive the ransomware amount. They are also typically the ones that you're negotiating with about the height of the ransom. And then the ransomware affiliates will get a certain percentage of that money. So 70% is like a default. It could be 80-20 if they're bringing lots of business, or 60-40 if they're new to the organization and need to prove their worth. But it's kind of like an app store model, 70-30, and then the ransomware affiliates end up with 70% of the revenue, while the ransomware operators end up with 30%. Now, once this has been paid, the targets will hopefully get back the keys to the kingdom, and then that will allow them to decrypt the data in their network. But I think it's good to mention here that this is not foolproof. So definitely the ransomware operators, developers, they will do their best to give you back the keys because they want to seem trustworthy, because if you don't get access back to your data and you put it out there on the internet, then why would the next victim pay? But this is not foolproof. Sometimes it doesn't work. Things have been encrypted multiple times. There could be some errors in the decryption program. So there could be all sorts of reasons why the key that you end up paying for will not allow you to get back access to your critical data. So as you see here, with all these steps combined, from the initial access brokers getting access in an untargeted way, developing that access, selling it off to ransomware affiliates, them using software from the ransomware operators, there are lots of different parties involved, and through the different steps that this attack actually goes through, and basically untargeted attack at the very beginning is going to a very targeted attack where they really know what kind of organizations that they're targeting, what their revenue is, and what a ransom what kind of ransom would be possible to ask them. So typically it will be somewhere around 3, 4, 5% of the revenue of a company that they would demand as the initial ransom, but that's definitely something that can be negotiated. So these are the actors behind the attacks. Now let's move on to the next part. What do these attacks actually look like? So we've talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to visualize it as well. Actually, these ransomware attacks, they go through different phases. So on a high level of abstraction, there are basically 3 phases that these attacks go through. So first of all, they're trying to get their foot in the door. They're trying to get one compromised system, one way to access a network of an organization. And as I mentioned, the three most prevalent methods to get this initial access to the network of a company would be phishing, the abuse of external remote services, and the exploitation of public-facing applications. So the external remote services typically through credentials, and then the exploitation, it has to do with vulnerabilities that have not been patched. Then once they have their foot in the door, once they have access to a network, typically as a low privileged user, they will try to develop that access by hacking through a network in order to gain higher privileges, to escalate their privileges, to move with those higher privileges to other systems in the network, to get more and more systems under control. They will generally strive to get domain administrator privileges. So those are the highest privileges within the network to Windows systems, because once they have that level of access, they can roll out their ransomware to all the Windows systems. So typically all workstations, most of the servers, to the file shares, and encrypt all of those systems with those high level of privileges. So this second phase, the hacking through the internal network part, is basically about maximizing the impact of a ransomware attack by getting as many systems as they can under control. Then in the final step, we all know data will be encrypted, but that's not the only thing that they do. So in this seek and destroy phase, as I've called it, they will try to find your backups and try to destroy your backups, because if they can destroy your backups, the likelihood that you will end up paying the ransom is just much higher. So if they can get access to the backups, they will definitely try to do so. Then a thing that has come up in the last couple of years is that they also steal data. So they go looking for sensitive emails or personal identifiable information from employees, from clients, source code, whatever they think is valuable to the company. They will try to steal that data and threaten to leak that data if you do not end up paying the ransom. So this is called double extortion, where they not only encrypt your systems, but also steal your data and try to pressure you in that way. And obviously, even if you have great backups and that they cannot be destroyed, the fact that they're holding this stolen data over your head is a reason for some companies to pay, even though they can recover their own data from backups. Now, what we've seen is that these actors are basically trying to maximize the value and the chance that companies will pay up the ransom through whatever means they have. So there are also triple extortion schemes where they try to put pressure on companies through additional means. So for instance, launching DDoS attacks. So while a company is trying to fend off this ransomware attack and has to recover systems, they're also being hit by DDoS attacks simultaneously, so that that really sort of overflows the capacity of a company to deal with these attacks all at the same time. But there are also other means in which they try to put pressure on companies. So we've even seen examples where call centers are being used to call up people in the company, to call up clients, to tell them that this ransomware attack is going on, to get pressure from clients and the public. They will contact journalists, they will contact clients, all in an attempt to put maximum amount of pressure on companies to end up paying the ransom. So these are basically the steps that these attacks go through, even though there are different kinds of actors behind the scenes working on it. Now, what can you do, right? So now we understand what kind of effects these attacks can have, who are behind them, what their modus operandi is. Now, what can we do knowing all this to defend our organizations? Well, the first thing I want to highlight is compartmentalization. So apply this wherever you can. The most important things, in my view, would be the network. So segmenting network segments, making sure there is strict filtering between those network segments, so that if someone has access to your network in one part, they cannot try and find vulnerabilities in all the different parts of your network. By compartmentalizing and this network segmentation and network filtering, you can really try to keep compromised compartmentalized, and it will take lots of extra effort for these attackers to extend their level of access within your network. Now you can apply this same technique, compartmentalization, to your identity and access management systems. This is often forgotten. Lots of companies use one big Active Directory, so one big Windows domain to manage everything, but you can reduce the effects of these kinds of attacks by compartmentalizing the Windows domain as well. So maybe using different domains, ideally without many trust relations between them, for different parts of the network, especially if you have, for instance, IT systems and OT systems. Then it would be really beneficial if the identity and access management systems are really separated, so that even though if all the IT is compromised, it's not really easy to make the step to the OT systems, that they have to start anew, basically from scratch, trying to escalate their privileges within the OT network again in order to gain full access there as well. And you can also use the Microsoft tiered administration model to also compartmentalize, for instance, the risk of domain admin level access within your network. So that would be the first tip, but this is obviously kind of a hard thing to realize. It will take years typically to get this fully functional. So this is a long-term strategy. The thing you can do on the short term is to apply multi-factor authentication. More and more systems include multi-factor authentication nowadays, and it's a really powerful and not very painful measure that you can implement, and that really raises the bar for attackers to gain access to your systems, to use that access to gain access to more systems. So multi-factor authentication, both on the external facing systems, but also within your internal network. So for instance, for high privileges and administration accounts, but also access to your crown jewels. It's a very effective measure that you can start implementing in a very short amount of time that will raise the bar for attackers. So multi-factor authentication wherever you can, basically. The next thing would be to pen test your infrastructure. I know lots of companies are doing pen testing, but what I see too often is that they're focusing on the external infrastructure. And the external infrastructure is important. I showed you some of the attack vectors that are being used in practice have to do with this external infrastructure, but there are also ways in which attackers can basically just bypass that external infrastructure. So for instance, through phishing emails, but also through supply chain attacks and all sorts of different attack vectors that allow them to bypass this whole external infrastructure that you may be focusing your penetration testing on. So I think you really have to assume breach, assume that one system in your whole infrastructure can be compromised. You don't know which one it will be. All of your internet-facing systems are at risk. And then how well is your organization positioned to defend the internal network once someone has acquired access to that network? So I would definitely advise companies to also do penetration testing on their internal infrastructure. I would even say that it's more important than the external infrastructure testing because it will show you how resilient you are if one system is compromised to prevent the whole network from being compromised. And obviously that is a whole different kind of ballgame in terms of the effect that it will have on your organization as a whole and your ability to keep pursuing your mission. So penetration testing on your full infrastructure. The next tip is to review and to test backup procedures. So historically, backup procedures are often part of the business continuity plans, the disaster recovery plans, and they have been developed as a way to deal with all sorts of natural disasters. So for instance, what if a fire occurs in my organization? Are we still able to recover from backups? So that is obviously very important, but what would work against fire is not something that would necessarily work against a ransomware attack. So for instance, having backups that can be reached on the network, as I call them online backups, they work great against fire, but if an attacker can get access to your backup through the network, then they can also destroy your backups. So then it would not really be effective. Also, even if you've thought about this, test those backup procedures, because too often we see that companies, when they are in dire circumstances and they have been hit by a ransomware attack, it turns out their backups were not working in the first place, or they don't know in which order they should recover the systems in order to get back up online. Definitely test those backup procedures in practice as well. The final tip here is to have a plan and test it. So rather than just the backup plan, really imagine that you're in this situation where your whole IT infrastructure has been encrypted. People cannot use their workstation anymore. Your file shares are down. Your intranet website is not working. Do you still have a list of how to contact like your important stakeholders? Like, can you contact your employees? Can you contact your supply chain, third parties, the people that need to get involved in dealing with this kind of attack, that need to know what's going on? Do you have a list of those people somewhere? What are you going to tell them? What are you going to do once you notice that this is going on in your network? Do you know if you're going to shut down systems, if you're going to disconnect them from the network? Can you disconnect different sites from your network? What would be the fallout effects from that? We need to inform about that. That's something you want to think about in advance because it might take some thought and you don't want to have to make split-second decisions about this. So have a plan and also test that plan, because there's a great quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, I think that's really true. You need to test your plan and see if it holds up in practice. Now, we've also thought about what can we bring to our clients in order to help them, because these are things you can start doing on your by yourself, but they're generalized and they don't apply to every company in the same way. But how can we help you to understand what you should be doing to raise your resilience against ransomware, raise your resilience against ransomware? Well, for that, we've come up with our ransomware resilience assessment. And basically, the idea here is that if you look at how these attackers are performing these attacks, getting in, hacking through, and doing seek and destroy, we have lots of services that are relevant to give you an idea of how well an attacker would be able to go through each of these stages. So for instance, in terms of getting in, we do external scenario-based penetration testing, which uses the same kinds of tools and techniques as these attackers do, trying to get into your network. And we do phishing attacks, which also simulate the same kind of techniques that these attackers are using to get into your network in order to defend against those kinds of attacks. But we also do internal scenario-based penetration testing. So trying to hack through your network, trying to gain access to critical assets in your network, using the same tools and techniques in order to really give you an idea of how well you would be positioned to deal with these kinds of attacks. And there are also some components that cover the full attack, the full chain from beginning to end. So for instance, our threat modeling and our security maturity review, they give you a better idea of where you stand in dealing with these attacks from end to end. So these are the different kinds of services that are relevant. Well, we've combined them in one ransomware resilience assessment where we look at how well are your people positioned to deal with these kinds of attacks, because they can be the weakest links in one of these attacks, but they can also be your first line of defense. And through a phishing assessment, we can get a better sense of how well they're positioned to deal with this attack and how you can improve basically their awareness and change their behavior for the better. Then in terms of the process element, we have the threat modeling and the security maturity review that from end to end of this attack chain give you a better idea of how well you're positioned to deal with these attacks. Then in terms of technology, we can do scenario-based penetration testing, both on the external infrastructure and on the internal part of your network, to also from end to end give you an assessment of how well your technology is suited to deal with these kinds of attacks. And then taken together, they will result in a measurement and a report that shows you what your organization's ransomware resilience level basically is at this moment, and a roadmap how to improve that further, that is tailored and goes way beyond the 5 generalized tips that I gave you earlier today. Now, if you want to know more about this ransomware resilience assessment, you can go to our website. We've launched this service. It has a white paper, a fact sheet that you can look at. It's at secura.com/RRA. Now, that brings us to the questions. Mike, I think you've been looking at these questions. What are our viewers wondering about?
Thank you very much, Paul. And just we've come up on time, but I will ask a couple of the questions that have come in, because they may be interesting for all users in case they're willing to stay for a couple of extra minutes. The first question is related to, the examples that you gave earlier, paying ransoms, but maybe more generally speaking, what is your guidance to an organization that's been hit by a ransomware attack? Should they pay the ransom or not?
I would say it really depends on the specific circumstances of the company. So ideally, obviously, you do not want to pay these criminals, basically because you're funding their criminal enterprise, you're keeping them going and allowing them to also target the next company. So if you're anywhere in a position to not pay up, please don't pay. Having said that, I also understand that some companies have no choice left. So for instance, if you were doing backups, but somehow these actors were able to destroy your backups, and you're basically facing the option to go bankrupt or to pay the ransom, then I also understand why you're not putting your employees on the street and that you have no other way than to pay up the ransom. So yeah, if you can recover from backups, please do. Also, if it's close, like the amount of time and effort it would cost to recover from backups versus paying the ransom, please opt to recover from backups. But in some cases, companies just don't have another option other than paying the ransom and hoping for the best.
Thanks, Paul. And second question is, when you identify a ransomware attack, or if the attack has been identified, should we disconnect our systems or shut down our systems?
Yeah, so those are basically the two best options that you have. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're just trying to save your data, to sort of save the access to your crown jewels, shutting them down is a good option. So if a system has not been encrypted yet, you can shut it down, and then at a later point in time, if you've called in the experts, you can see if you can still get back access to the data before it has been encrypted. So because if it's shut off, it's not being encrypted, right? So that would be a good option to especially save some of your crown jewels. Having said that, disconnecting systems is also a good option because that will also allow researchers, so forensic specialists, to go into the systems and to figure out what was actually going on, what kind of malware is being used, what was it targeting. So the forensic investigation will be helped if you're not shutting down the system, because if you're shutting down, all the information that is in memory is being lost. So again, this is something that I would make part of the plan. Think about this in advance. Maybe you will just disconnect some systems for forensic purposes, then shut down some of your crown jewels to really make sure that they're not being encrypted anymore. And if there are certain sites, for instance, or parts of your network that have not been affected at all, and you can disconnect entire parts of your network from an infected component of your network, that would also be really helpful to stop the spread of this ransomware through your network.
Okay, and we'll take one more question. For those, if we haven't addressed your question, please don't worry. We will come back to you via email. If you want us to follow up with, if you have any other questions, do drop them in the chat and we will answer you via email. Before we close, Paul, let me just ask one more question that's come in, which is, how resilient and prepared do you think organizations are generally in either the Netherlands or the EU? The question was asking specifically about semi-governmental or governmental organizations, but I think you could apply that broader and organizations in general. Based on what you've seen, how well prepared do you think organizations are today to address this threat?
Yeah, so again, it depends on what sector you are in. So some sectors have been dealing with these kinds of attacks for much longer. So not just ransomware attacks, but just being the target of hackers, especially like, for instance, in the financial sector, they've been dealing with these kinds of attacks for years. So they have very mature security programs generally. that are also, and they're also in a good position to fend off these kinds of attacks. But there are also all sorts of smaller firms, for instance, that are only started to being targeted right now, because back in the day they were not really being targeted by hackers, but with this new sort of business model, everyone can be a target. So for them, it's a new thing. They generally don't have a very mature security program, so they really have to step up their game in order to fend off these attacks. And I would say the public sector is somewhere in between. Yeah, it will really, it's quite of a wide range. Some parts of the government have really secure maturity programs, others don't. So yeah, it will depend on the individual organization, how well they're positioned to deal with this.
Okay, let's hold it there. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you everybody who has asked a question and for your participation today. We will follow up with you if we didn't get to your question. And please keep an eye out for more webinars in the future from Paul and from other experts at Secura. And we do hope to have your feedback in the final survey regarding today's webinar. We'll end there. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, so let me just add one more thing here. If you have any other questions that you did not post in the chat, if you want more information, if you want to talk to us about your situation, feel free to send me an email. My email address is paul.pols@secura.com. I'm sure you can also email Mike, that he's also always up for dealing with your emails. So you can email him at mike.nichols@bureauveritas.com. So yeah, if there's anything you want to talk to us about, feel free to contact us. And yeah, once you close this webinar, this is the pop-up that you will get. It's not phishing. We're really interested in to know what you think about our webinar. Please give us some feedback, how we can improve for next time. It's always welcome. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks everybody. Have a great day.